Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Live at the Library. I'm Aslihan Bulut, and I have the privilege of serving as the Law Librarian of Congress. I see, please come in. This event is titled Joining Together in Tocqueville's America, and our presenter is Dr. Kevin Butterfield. Dr. Butterfield will be discussing his book, The Making of Tocqueville's America, Law and Association in the Early United States. This event supports the new Library of Congress exhibition, Join in Voluntary Associations in America, which we invite you to visit. Dr. Butterfield is the director of the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. He is a historian of the post-revolutionary United States. He most recently served as executive director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Dr. Butterfield earned a BA in history from the University of Missouri and MA in history from the College of William and Mary, and a PhD in history from Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Butterfield will take 10 minutes of questions at the end of the presentation. We just ask that you hold up your hand during the Q&A segment, and a staff member will come around to you with a microphone. So thank you and enjoy.
Joining together in Tocqueville's America, for a lot of us might beg the question, why are we calling it Tocqueville's America? He's a Frenchman. He spent a total of 9 or 10 months in the United States in 1831 and 1832, despite having written a remarkably influential book called Democracy in America, it's an interesting appellation to call this period of American history Tocqueville's America. And the reason is, as I'll come to, is that he put his finger on something that Americans were just beginning to notice themselves, and that is the phenomenon of association, joining together to do things, small and big. And I'm struck by how succinctly he put this observation on this new phenomenon in the world that stood in stark contrast to what he saw in France, and in his readings about the past. He saw something new here, and he called attention to it. Americans of all ages and all conditions, all minds, constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which they take part, but they also have 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, grave, feudal, very general, very particular, immense, and very small. Everywhere that at the head of a new undertaking you see the government in France and a great lord in England, count on it that you will perceive an association in the United States. This is something I think we can connect with. The most recent biography of Alexis de Tocqueville by Olivier Zuns, published simultaneously in French and English, says that essentially, I think persuasively, that Tocqueville saw something that Americans had yet to see themselves, that he persuaded Americans that this was something they should take seriously about themselves, because Democracy in America was published in English in 1835 and again in 1840. And the translations come out quite quickly. And the Americans were struck by Tocqueville's observations on exactly this point. Here I am talking to Olivier when he came last December to the Library of Congress to talk about this new and important work. What do we have here, though? When we describe associations in America, we have an interesting question, right? There's so many of them. Why are they important? What do they do? Tocqueville observed, and he noticed that they were different and they were unique here. But the literature, I think, gets a little richer following that. In the 1830s is the first time you start seeing voluntary associations described as something that stand out from the landscape. The peculiar glory of the present age, as Francis Whalen said. A century or so later, you start to see American scholars in particular really latching onto this. Arthur Schlesinger famously called the nation a nation of joiners. And I think, though, it's really with the fall of the Iron Curtain that scholarship gets interesting on this subject, that is trying to put their finger on, political scientists, sociologists, historians, trying to put their finger on whether this is something that helps explain why democracy works here in the United States and has had struggles in other places, trying to really put their finger on how useful this civil society or this landscape of associations might be for emerging democracies. So a really rich literature emerges then. And in the last couple of decades, since the turn of the 21st century, I think we've just really complicated and sort of dove deep and tried to have a better understanding of this civil society, which is a good catch-all term for that landscape of associations and corporations and all kinds of political groups that shape a democracy. Here's a number of books, including my own, that in the last couple of decades have really dove deep and helped us to understand this phenomenon. Arthur Schlesinger, by the way, this is senior, not junior, junior who worked hand in hand with President Kennedy. His father, Arthur Schlesinger, in this biography of A Nation of Joiners, I think gives us the fully positive version of this, for the most part. There's a little bit of attention to the ways in which associations might have negative consequences for society too, but really a really positive and laudatory version of this nation of joiners. When I mention civil society, there's another term that gets used in the beginning in the 1980s and 1990s that comes out of literature that was deeply influenced by the recipient of the John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity in the year 2015. I'm the director of that center, and this biannual prize is a way of recognizing serious achievement. Jürgen Habermas, his work focused on this area between basically the individual or the family and the government, and all that stuff that happens, clubs and societies, but also politics, the media, people chatting in a coffee house, that phenomenon is something that he found really useful, and this was useful in the post-1989 period of trying to work with emerging democracies. He found useful for explaining how exactly public opinion is formed, and organizations and clubs and societies help to play an important role there. But I think this story is really well told not too far down the hall here in the Jefferson Building, through the Great Hall and down another hall, right past Thomas Jefferson's library, in the new Join In exhibit, which brings to not just the history, but it actually sort of also stops and takes a good look at the breadth, the scale of association formation in the United States. When you walk around the outside of this exhibit, you'll be seeing things, fraternal organizations all the way to the Boy Scouts in the 21st century, all kinds of organizations and clubs and societies and all parts of society that ring around here. And in the middle, right underneath this wooden framework here, you see things like this. You see the colonial background of the age of associations. That is things like the Mayflower Compact, famously, right? This people deciding to come together, create a body politic out of nothing, just out of signing a piece of paper and agreeing to it. That phenomenon is a useful background and it has some explanatory power. Church covenants, colonial charters, and of course famously that Mayflower Compact. When you go a bit further into the colonial period, Ben Franklin has a prominent spot here, as he should, as a great pioneer in association formation. And I labeled this the technology of association. That's not actually what this section is called, but it really is a pretty useful way of conceiving of it, and the word technology does appear in the exhibit, because once you learn how to form clubs and societies, it's a really replicable thing. You can do it again. You can copy a constitution, you can copy bylaws, you can find a way to form another debating society from the next town over and help to continue to expand the civil and civic life of the nation. But right at the heart, you can find a beautiful first edition of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America in its original yellow wrappers, published in French after his 9 months of travel in the United States. And it's there where, again, we see a great touch, a great connection to the American way of life that Americans were somewhat blinded to themselves. But I like talking about not just Tocqueville, but Tocqueville's America. What is it that he saw? Because he actually went pretty far. He went all the way, after landing on the East Coast, he finds himself all the way into Canada, but also Michigan, where there were essentially no white settlers once he reached the farthest point of his travels west of Detroit, all the way to the Deep South through New Orleans, hurried up through the Deep South, spent a brief amount of time in Washington, D.C., and left again. But in that time, he saw quite a bit of the United States and put his finger on a lot of interesting phenomena, including this phenomenon of association. But where everyone, I think, gives a lot of credit to Tocqueville as being the very first to describe this, there is one American that I think beats him to it just by a smidge. William Ellery Channing, any Unitarians in the room may actually know this name, has a really interesting essay just about a year and a half before Tocqueville winds up on the shores of the United States. And he says essentially the same things Tocqueville does and asks some interesting questions about it. He says, it may be said without much exaggeration that everything is done now by societies. Men have learned what wonders can be accomplished in certain cases by union and seem to think that union is competent to everything. You could scarcely name an object for which some institution has not been formed. Would men spread one set of opinions or crush another, they make a society. Would they improve the penal code or relieve poor debtors, they make a society. It is very easy to conceive, and I like this, it is very easy, we conceive, to explain this great development of the principle of cooperation. So Tocqueville notices it, and he does try to explain it a bit, but I could talk a little bit about the limitations there, perhaps in questions and answers. But Channing has an explanation for why this happened, and he says the main cause is the immense facility given to intercourse by modern improvements, by increased commerce and traveling, by the post office, by the steamboat, and especially by the press, by newspapers, periodicals, tracts, and other publications. In other words, the transportation revolution and the communications revolutions of the early 19th century explain the phenomenon of association. And actually, he's not far off, right? If you look at the number of post offices, particularly per capita, it's astonishing, the growth in the postal communication across 3 decades between 1800 and 1830. Same with newspapers. The number circulated and the number of people reached by these newspapers massively grows. And it's not just a matter of population, right? The population grows, but it roughly doubles plus a bit. And a good portion of that is the enslaved population, as you see, some 2 million people out of 12.8 million in 1830 were enslaved. So the population is growing, but not at the rate that communications and transportation and effective dispersal of ideas is made possible. So Channing puts his finger there, and I think it's worth taking note that there is something, when I describe a technology of association, it then needs a medium, right? It needs a way to communicate from place to place. And the things that Channing describes, actual transportation as well as media, are key. But I'm not going to talk forever in broad strokes. I want to talk about 2 things, 2 obscure associations that long predate Tocqueville's arrival, long predate Channing's birth, that actually, I think, tell us a lot about joining in Tocqueville's America. One of them is the Patriotic Society of Richmond, Virginia, founded in 1786, not very long-lived. If you've heard of it, I'd be surprised, but there might be 1 or 2 that have. And another is even more obscure, I find even more interesting, the Ladies' Literary Society of Norwich, Connecticut, founded in 1800. And you'll see here that I've got a couple of takeaways for each of them. One of them is well, I'll get to them. Okay, the Patriotic Society. They met in Richmond, 1786, a quick snapshot in time. The revolution ends successfully with independence and the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and the United States Constitution is drafted in 1787. That period in between, right, just a handful of years, often called the critical period because no one was quite sure what would happen, whether the nation would spin apart, whether the Articles of Confederation would be enough. And in this period, in 1786, a group of patriotic citizens, obviously, gathered together at the Richmond Courthouse, and it was reported, their gathering was reported as far north as New Hampshire, as far south as South Carolina. George Washington is a part of this story, and a quick aside, as you heard in my introduction, I spent a good number of years at Mount Vernon as the director of the library there. And so George Washington and this one beautiful library, where actually many of the papers of Bushrod Washington are collected, is a part of the story. And Bushrod Washington obviously is. Okay, but if you remember one thing about George Washington, it might be his farewell address, his advice to the nation on departing the presidency. That's probably not the one thing you remember, but it's one of 5 or 6 things you might remember. This is a great and beautiful print of the farewell address from the Library of Congress's collections from the 1850s. And you'll notice there that Washington has all kinds of anxiety about associations. Famously, all obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or all the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are destructive of this fundamental principle and a fatal tendency of this fundamental principle of union. They serve to organize faction, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you can go long before George Washington's presidency, during which he had all kinds of challenges brought to his political life by what were then called democratic societies in the early 1790s. Long before that, in this critical period in the 1780s, you can actually see George Washington beginning to think through his attitude towards associations in the United States in the context of the patriotic society that his nephew, Bushrod Washington, had helped to form. So Bushrod Washington wrote to his extraordinarily famous and extraordinarily intimidating uncle in September of 1786. And he describes what's going on. He says, "We've lately instituted a society in these lower counties in Virginia called the Patriotic Society," and he describes the purpose of it. And the purpose essentially is to talk about politics, to talk about the decisions that we ought to make as Republican citizens, the means of attaining the happiness of the people, to inquire into the conduct of those who represent us, basically a political discussion organization. And they did meet, as we saw in that newspaper from the library's collections in October of 1786. Now, George Washington responded to his nephew and is not a fan of the idea, and as you'll see in Bushrod's response, he's chastened very, very quickly by this. "Generally speaking, I have seen as much evil as good result from such societies as you describe the Constitution of yours to be. They are a kind of imperium imperio, a government within a government, and as often clog as facilitate public measures. It appears, and I'll skip down, it appears a much wiser and more politic conduct to choose able and honest representatives rather than have ordinary citizens sit and talk about politics." This is interesting, and there is a little bit of a classic 18th century anxiety about associations that long predates George Washington even, and that is that they are the nucleus of faction, of subversion. But it gets more interesting than that, because George Bushrod is, as he goes on to read in this letter, is given a better sense of what exactly is concerning his uncle, George Washington. What reason is there to expect that the society itself may be accordant in opinion on the subjects that it discusses, different political issues? May not a few members of this society, more sagacious and designing than the rest, direct the measures of it to private views of their own? And he begins to put his finger on something that I think is an important through line in the discussion of associations in American life. And that is that as soon as you form an association, you're giving up some element of your autonomy, the individual autonomy that you have as a sui juris and voting Republican citizen, is in some ways empowered by joining an organization that can then champion a cause. But in other ways, you're all of a sudden a part of another body politic, one that may lay claims to you or take you in directions you hadn't originally intended. And George Washington is sensitive to this in 1786. But this is a fascinating letter, because farther down, you can actually see George Washington beginning to second guess himself. He's thinking this through, and he says, "These are my first thoughts. I give no decided opinion. Societies very similar as such that you speak have been formed, and what has been the consequence?" There he's referring to Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, or the early rumblings of it. "You may say that no such matters are in contemplation by your society. Granted, but a snowball gathers by rolling." He's just thinking it through, and this is how you know he's thinking it through. Hurried as this letter is, "I'm sensible I am writing to you upon a very important subject, and I have no time to copy, correct, or even to peruse it, for which reason I could wish to have it or a copy returned to me." He wants to continue thinking this through, right? And so he actually asks his nephew to send him back a copy of this letter that he doesn't have time to copy himself. The exchange, by the way, which goes on in the papers of George Washington, housed here at the Library of Congress, continues, and essentially Bushrod is sheepish and saying, "Well, we didn't mean anything by it, and your advice is useful." And over the course of the next couple of letters, they move on to other subjects. But that question of what happens when you join an organization, particularly one for political action, takes real life with the formation of those democratic clubs in the 1790s. Roughly in 1793-4, particularly in 1794 and 5, you see all 1794 and 5, you see all the kinds of political debating societies and particularly politically active groups called democratic or democratic republican societies that form up and down the Atlantic seaboard. And people begin to seize on the exact issue that Washington was troubled by. The moment a man is attached to a club, his mind is not free, right? The club can actually begin to sort of shape his thinking and warp it and take it in new directions. William Wilcox says that I know that in all societies, even in legislatures, a few often have led unsuspecting, honest meaning men to become instruments of injustice and designs they have detested when it was too late. Men who may be moral in isolation become immoral if they're acting in a mob, right? That moral man and moral society point. This is one that in the 1790s, you see a lot of attention to this. And it's an interesting question that I think helps us to understand some of what happens with joining together in Tocqueville's America. Because by the 1820s, William Ellery Channing is saying quite the same thing, but with a new power to it. There is cause to fear and to withstand great associations as far as they interfere with or restrain individual action, personal independence, private judgment, free, self-originated effort. They are perilous instruments. They ought to be suspected. What is he talking about here? He's talking about things like the American Temperance Society, the early formation of anti-slavery societies. He's troubled by these really causes he agrees with, by the way, but he's troubled by the way that these massive politically mobilizing organizations might begin to chip away at the individual freedom of thought that was so important to him. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Abraham Lincoln, great examples of men who were anti-slavery and anti-excessive drinking. Neither of them joined anti-slavery societies or temperance societies, and they were very articulate about why. It's exactly this point. It's this frustration or anxiety that associations can begin to not enhance but limit the autonomy of individual citizens. And that is actually related to, and I think closely related to in a way that scholars who have written on the subject haven't paid quite enough attention to, one of the more interesting phenomena of the 1820s. And here you see an image of George Washington as a Freemason. And so the irony is pretty clear here. In the 1820s, particularly in 1826, there's a powerful anti-Masonic movement, a backlash against Freemasonry that's connected intellectually, ideologically, to exactly the things that I've been talking about that Channing and George Washington put their fingers on. Because the anti-Masonic movement, this grassroots, it becomes the first third-party organization in American life. They actually run a new candidate for president in a third-party form, a guy named William Wirt, who's buried right here in Washington, D.C. This anti-Masonic movement, even though it begins as a missing persons movement, there's a disappearance of a prominent after he disappears, of a man who is about to publish some Masonic rituals and secrets, a man named William Morgan in upstate New York. And with his disappearance and the inability to actually bring anyone to justice after it was clear that he'd been kidnapped and then never seen again, quite possibly, and I would say probably drowned in the Niagara River, by some overzealous Freemasons who thought that they were silencing someone who was who's about ready to expose rituals that were important to them. But this is all essentially unknown because of the inability to solve that crime. What began as a missing persons movement becomes a full-blown, powerful anti-association movement, really, but one focused on a particular fraternal organization, Freemasonry. The 500 lodges that were in New York in 1825 are reduced to a shell by 1835. 100,000 Masons in 1826 is reduced to 40,000, most of whom are at this point not even calling themselves Freemasons in 1835. A number of states ban taking oaths outside of a courtroom in a deliberate effort to keep Masons from having their members take oaths. Grand Lodges shut down in a number of states. William Wirt, whom I mentioned, wins 8% of the national vote, actually won some electoral votes. So anytime you look at a presidential election history, you'll see an interesting third party pop up in the 1832 election. This anti-Masonic movement has its intellectual origins, I think, in this anxiety about people giving up so much of themselves by taking oaths or overly committing themselves to a private association. And that motif, that through line in Americans' embrace but also anxiety about associations in the early United States is one that I think helps us to understand what are otherwise quite inexplicable things, like a full-blown backlash to a pretty harmless fraternal organization, Freemasonry, in the 1820s. Francis Wayland, president of Brown University, a great moral thinker, actually writes an essay on this problem in the 1830s and puts his finger again on this question of the limitations of association and how it can help to impair private thought and freedom of the intellectual freedom that was so important to this first generations of American citizens. He actually is, when he's describing a pledge, by the way, that's the pledge to temperance societies and anti-slavery societies were the most common ones. And again, he's a temperate man and an anti-slavery man, but he is concerned at people giving up essentially their ability to change their mind, should they ever be persuaded by new information, by taking a pledge or taking an oath to a certain cause. And in this essay, I think you find something that kind of seems like a tempest in a teapot, but again, it is an important through line across 2 or 3 generations of the first American citizens as they think through the dangers and the possible benefits of association. But people like to join together. So we've talked about the Patriotic Society of Richmond. Let's talk now about the Ladies' Literary Society, because I find this element of American association formation so fascinating. And that is and by the way, this is Abigail Adams, has nothing to do with the Ladies' Literary Society of Norwich, Connecticut. I have no portraits of any of the women involved with this organization because it is fairly obscure. Thankfully, it exists because their minutes survive in the Connecticut Historical Society. But I did want to give you some taste of the, oh, there she is. I did want to give you some taste of the ways in which these associations were such an important part of women in early American life and into the 19th and 20th centuries finding a political voice, right? And Abigail Adams, of course, had a political voice and access to political power in ways that other women did not. But you see it elsewhere in the phenomena of association, how they do it, and what they do with it. Okay, in 1800, and this is, there's a lot of backstory that I could tell that I was able to piece together in the Connecticut archives. These women all knew each other. They'd been essentially joining together informally since 1790 out of a congregational church in Norwich. At some point, seemingly out of thin air, they decided that they wanted to more formally organize. They wanted to draw up a constitution, they wanted to keep a book of minutes, and they wanted to do more together. So they actually, in January of 1800, they draw up what looks a lot like, frankly, the Mayflower Compact or any other voluntary association constitution that you can see in the early republic in particular. They draw up a document that says when exactly they'll meet, why they're meeting. We the undersigned, or we the subscribers, is a really common phrase that you'll see in the constitutions and bylaws of these kinds of organizations. And they decide that they want to get together to read and discuss. When they come back together periodically, by March of 1800, they create a committee to frame a set of rules to be laid before the society, which approving they shall pass into laws binding on every member of the society. Again, these are women that have been hanging out for a decade, have had plenty of opportunities to do everything that they want to do in this organization without drawing up a constitution and bylaws. So it's just fascinating to me that they do it, and fascinating to me the ways that they go about doing it. April 2nd, they draw up a constitution that's adopted almost unanimously. I'm curious about that phrase because someone clearly wasn't happy about it. And in this constitution, they actually have a number of articles, all of which could be amended with a 2/3 vote, should the ladies change their mind, except for 4. And they're all right here. These are the 4 articles that just can't be amended. The meeting will always be opened by reading from the Bible, no matter what else they're reading that night. The first Wednesday of the month, they'll collect some funds, but not too many. There's actually a limit on how much money the women might be called on to pay. Any member dishonoring yourself can be expelled, but with a certain vote. They want to make sure you can't amend that and sort of change the rules and kick someone out unfairly. And that no religious or political dispute shall ever enter the society. On the concurrence of 2/3, they can amend any other part of the Constitution, but here's ways that they can't, right? They're essentially tying themselves to the mast in the famous Odysseus or Ulysses story of being able to prevent yourself from doing something that you really want to do, but you've limited yourself by a formal restriction, in this case, a constitutional one. So they draw up this Constitution. By the way, the same night that they adopt the Constitution, one of their readings for that night is the United States Constitution. They actually sit and read it together, which they've already written their own, so it's not as if they're reading it and cribbing from it so much as they're just embracing the constitutional element, the constitutional mindset. When they come to another year or two later, they're gathering together. There's actually one little anecdote in 1800, right after they draft this Constitution, and before they've lived under it very long, they wind up violating one of those 4 articles right away, because the very next time after they've adopted the Constitution, the first thing that they read that night is their own Constitution, and the second thing they read is a passage from the Bible. So it's just, ironically enough, their constitutional impulse is so strong that they violated their own Constitution. Come 1802, you see Miss Mary Tyler. This is not her, but I think this is probably a similar age. This is from the collections at Colonial Williamsburg. She is giving the annual address. It's an opportunity to stand in front of roughly 30 or 40 women, again, that she knows very, very well, and reminds them, we shall do well if we pay a strict attention to the rules of our institution. They were formed by the most judicious of our society and calculated for the good of the whole. We can always change our minds, except for some areas where we can't. But if we ever depart from our rules, we are sure of creating uneasiness for ourselves and others. In 1803, another annual message, similar message comes from another presiding a woman for the organization. In that anniversary address, they again point out the value of these rules. Now, this very idea, by the way, of ordinary people drawing up constitutions in the aftermath of the state and federal constitution making of the 1770s and 1780s, it's a really interesting phenomenon itself, right? That is, ordinary people, what I call in my book everyday constitutionalism, ordinary people deciding to experiment and work with constitutions in their own clubs and societies is, in some ways, it's mimicry. It's learning more about what it is to be a good citizen of the United States. In this case, these are women who can't vote for another several generations, but they're acting politically. They're drawing up a constitution. But in other ways, I think it goes beyond mere mimicry. It's actually a sense of how we, as thinking and cooperating individuals, find ways to, as Ms. Mary Tyler says, make things easy for ourselves. Procedure and procedural regularity helps. There is some value in rules and procedure. Felix Frankfurter famously says, the history of freedom in America is in no small part the history of procedure, or some such thing. And that phenomenon, that way of thinking is deep in the American mind. That formality, that formalistic approach to association, here you see an image of William Lloyd Garrison, I think the first person who could be photographed that I've talked about here tonight. He actually, very interestingly, writes to an organization, to some white members of a ladies' anti-slavery society, explaining to them why it is that they should be untroubled by bringing in African-American members to their organization. Now, he, of course, wants there to be multiracial advocacy organizations fighting against the institution of slavery. He very much wants that. But in writing to these white members of the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in New York, he's essentially reminding them that you're not inviting them into your parlors, you're not becoming best friends with these people with whom you might have some racial animus. What you're doing is joining together. You're contributing and allowing them to contribute combine their influence with yours. And the formality, the fact that becoming a member is a formal process and not an affectionate one, right, is being put to good use here, right? Finding ways to create multiracial cooperative organizations by essentially reminding people that membership is also about process and about regular procedure, and not something that you have to stop and hesitate because you might be joining hands with someone that, again, in the 1830s have real racial animus. Now, the Join In exhibit farther down the hall here has other great examples of women's organizations, whether it's the Women's Christian Temperance Union from the much later 19th century and into the 20th, or the clubs, the sort of civic organizations of women's clubs in the early 20th century. And this phenomenon, this way in which non-politically active citizens can come together and have a real impact before the 19th Amendment finally allowed women to vote across the nation, is something that I think is an important part of the story. That is, the impact of these organizations in transforming civil society is without doubt a major part of what we should value and what we should understand about American associations. But it's also quite interesting that the civic practice of just joining together and finding ways to act and think constitutionally, legalistically, law-mindedly is a useful way of describing this, means that women, Mary Tyler and the women of Norwich, Connecticut, are acting politically with one another in ways that they find deeply edifying, clearly. They find this to be an important part of what they're doing together, and I find that to be an important part of the story too. It's not simply about civic empowerment and transforming the public sphere, so much as it is being able to practice civics on a day-to-day basis. So to return to Tocqueville, why does all this matter? I think that the stories of American associations, the positives, the negatives, the anxieties, the frustrations, are really deep a part of our of the American mind, of how we think about these civic and political phenomena that are so important to our history. George Washington and Bushrod Washington's exchange I find to be really informative of an anxiety that can seem a bit silly at times, right? No, I don't think any of us feel deeply disempowered because we're members of the American Automobile Association or a similar organization. But that's because, I think, of the evolution of these associations, finding ways to have attenuated, limited commitments and still be able to join forces to accomplish good things. And when you go to the Ladies Literary Society in Norwich, Connecticut, there too you see an interesting part of the story. And I think there's two things that stand out to me. There's the technology of association, right? The finding ways to join together that are similar to, drawn from other examples that they're reading out in the world. Clearly, the newspaper circulation of other constitutions and bylaws, hugely important to telling the story. But beyond that technology of association, there's also just the civic practice, right? That is, these women and many women like them all over geographically, both north and south and into the west, you see these kinds of organizations. Female benevolent societies is a common organization that you can find in just about any town of any size in the 1830s and 40s. And that practice, finding ways to join together even when they're civically disempowered and have no vote, have no real connection to political power in the United States, is such an important part of the story, an important part of how our civic practices became so deeply a part of our society. To go back to that initial question, can this nation of joiners, can this public sphere phenomenon help us to understand what makes democracies work, right? Why they work in some places and not in others? Tocqueville very clearly says yes. Other Americans can, I think, actually even those who are quite critical of these organizations, found ways that they could say yes to. And I want to put my finger on exactly one last point here before I open it up for questions. That anti-Masonic movement that I think has this interesting backlash to a powerful fraternal organization. There's so much you could say about it. But one of the ways that anti-Masons combated Freemasonry forming associations all the time. You can find anti-Masonic, Young Men's Anti-Masonic Association of Boston, here and there and everywhere. You can find association formation of a certain kind to combat what they saw as an evil association. And in these associations, they would have clearly articulated dues. They would have a clear constitutional description that anyone could come to their meetings. There would be nothing done in secret. All the things that they wanted to sort of wipe out about Freemasonry, they wrote out of their organizations. So associations to combat associations is another really fascinating part of the American story. And with that, I'm open to any questions. Wait for the microphone, please. Robert, right here in the middle.
I had a couple of questions. One is whether you also think that the milieu of our early republic was also kind of helped form the associations in terms of not as much of a class society and not having these other institutions like a monarchy, a strong national church, and that type of thing. And the other thing is just a question is whether Robert's Rule of Order, when is that an American? Is that American or is that from somewhere?
This is British, right? Unitarians wrote Robert's Rule of Order. Okay, so there's an answer for the last
That's
one.
another kind of like.
And I love that answer. That actually syncs really nicely with William Channing's role here. On the first one, yes, absolutely. Tocqueville says this, and others say it as well, that the flatness, the general equality of American society, that there are no aristocrats, and of course Tocqueville, I think, is describing things a little too succinctly to say that all Americans were equal, clearly. But that general equality, he described also as an equal powerlessness to accomplish much, right? Everyone was equally powerless to really do much individually, and so they needed to band together. That was his explanation for why Americans joined together, more or less. He's not quite as attuned to the technology of association and the fact that this just becomes a replicable thing. And he's not quite as attuned, frankly, to what I think is, to your point about the culture of the early republic, that is a sense that this is also not just what equal citizens do, but what Republican citizens do, right? That is citizens that have already been experiencing the self-government. And here Tocqueville does describe how jury service, town governments help to sort of disseminate some of these ideas. But essentially, yeah, you're exactly right that the truncatedness of American society, that there is no powerful aristocrat, is a part of the explanation, which is why Tocqueville's explanation for the vibrancy of associational life in the early United States, it doesn't quite apply to the 20th century, where we lack aristocracy, but we certainly have philanthropic figures, the Carnegies and the Mellons, that can single-handedly transform and make a cause happen. That's something that doesn't exist in Tocqueville's time. I'll let you, Robert, do you want to choose? Thank you.
Seeing your slides brought up the rules where they say they would open their meeting, the Women's Society of Norwich,
Yeah.
with a member making a reading of their own selection from the Bible. But then the rule is there would be no religious or political disputes at the meeting.
Yeah.
Where is the raising religion versus disputes? So the organization, I'm trying to figure out where you break that line down. If it's only disputes that aren't allowed, where is the discussion with Tocqueville's self-governing would be people practicing their religion?
Yeah.
Democracy, that local, community-based, doing the work of religion would be self-governing.
This might be an interesting example of where the kind of the historical preciseness of this situation is key. They were all members of the same church. They initially got together out of a congregational prayer society. So I don't think they would ever have described reading the Bible in a way that was divisive. But it's actually interesting you say this, because the American Bible Society, one of the first national, really powerful and in some ways really rich organizations of the early 19th century, They too believed that printing the Bible, as long as you didn't add notes to it or any kind of commentary or say anything at all that might be divisive, that was a unifying thing and not a there was nothing that might be that smack of a religious dispute about simply the text of the Bible, as long as you don't add anything to it. And so I think that's just a fairly commonplace approach to things in the early 19th century. Is that getting at your question?
I'll be puzzling on it for a while.
Okay.
It's like where it hasn't been, is seeing America is sort of where that line becomes. Where is democracy that you have your religious liberty, and then where is it we don't dispute the aspects?
Yeah.
I'll be puzzling with that for a while.
Yeah, that's a good thing to puzzle over. Yeah. Others?
Hi. So my question has to do with banking associations.
Sure.
Just sort of generally how they fit into the story you're telling. And then secondly, you said something towards the beginning about sort of limitations simply with forming associations to begin with. That these aren't exactly spontaneous and they aren't exactly free-flowing. There are some restrictions on how and when and where these kinds of associations pop up. So, thank you.
So banking associations, the corporate form is a part of the story. It's one I didn't get into tonight because it's two other elements of my work that I didn't want to dive into too deeply are the formally legal side. I was kind of talking about the law-mindedness of all this, but the formally legal side of this is that in this period between the 1780s and the 1830s, you see a massive proliferation of corporation formation. 1832 is, so basically the year right after Tocqueville wanders around, is when the very first treatise in the Anglo-American law literature, the very first treatise on private corporations is published by two Rhode Island lawyers in 1832. And it's because Americans were really leading in this, right? They formed corporations at a greater pace and with a greater range of uses than any other society. And that's been described in a couple of ways. Pauline Maier famously says that it's basically mimicking the constitutions, right? That it's part of that. I think there's a little more to it than that. And again, technology I think comes into it as well. But when you say banking associations, I think corporate form, and there is a pretty complicated, but I think parallel story to some of the things that I'm describing, where what it was to be a member of a corporation is being worked out at exactly this time. Between the 1800s and the 1830s, you see a lot of clarity about what a member of a corporation who happens to own stock, essentially, in a corporation is entitled to, how they can become one, right? Can they become one involuntarily? Up until 1803, the answer was yes. You could be compelled to become a member of a corporation that was going to build a street in your town or whatever. But then famously in 1803, a Massachusetts court says, no, that's not, these should be voluntary organizations, not involuntary ones. All of that, I think, is a part of the story. And the second part of your question regarded...
The limitations on the creation of these associations.
Yeah.
Which is something at the beginning, wanted to expand on further in Q&A.
Yeah, I'm not sure what kinds of limitations I was referring to when I was describing this. I think one of the things, particularly in the 18th century, coming into the 19th, that impeded, I think, the initial spread of these kinds of organizations of all kinds, particularly politically minded ones, was the sense that they were factious and dangerous for the Republic. And that limitation, it becomes a partisan thing, right? The Jeffersonian side of things, forms these organizations, whereas the other side says, well, we're not going to do that at all. But then by the right around 1800, thereabouts, Federalist societies, and they tended to call themselves Washington Benevolent Societies, decided they needed to get into the game too. And so both parties are doing it. One of the biggest limitations on this was what I would describe as an 18th century anxiety about associations that starts to become morphed into what I describe with Wayland and Channing and others. That is, that these associations are here, and they're going to do massively influential and important things in American political life and civic life. But here's some things you need to be cautious about. So that's one of the limitations that I would point to. I see a question in the background.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is very interesting. I'm curious if a democracy requires associations for involvement, because I'm struck by the sociological commentary now about bowling alone, not joining association, and the undermining of democracy in democratic processes and getting your voice heard.
Yeah.
Do you see a connection,
Great
concern?
question. Great question. Robert Putnam famously wrote a book called Bowling Alone. People used to bowl in leagues. Now if they go bowling at all, they go bowling alone or with a couple of friends. That phenomenon largely it bears out in a lot of categories. If you look at Freemasonry, for instance, the peak membership year for Freemasons was in either 1963 or 1959. For some reason, I'm blanking on which, but it's been a steady decline ever since, and similar organizations, some of which no longer even exist. Yeah, that's right. Attending organized religious services decline, all kinds of decline. Now, Putnam would say the danger to that, Putnam and others, the danger that poses for democracy is eroding of what he called social capital, this sense that you can trust the people around you, that you have enough interactions with them, not just people who are just like you, but people from other walks of life too, that you spend time with, and you develop a sense of trust that is valuable for the civic order. I don't know. The question of whether it's essential to democracy, I think it's certainly not essential to a founding era vision of what democracy needed to be, because the founders were so deeply troubled by these things that it's clear that they could imagine a civic life where everyone comes to the poll, all white men come to the polls and find ways to participate without having much mediation between them and the government. But in practice, that just didn't work. A, it didn't work that way, and B, I don't think it could have worked that way as the democratic societies became more complex. So I do find these kinds of organizations, particularly political advocacy organizations that help to push and advocate for a particular cause, as essential parts of the order. Whether political parties are essential to the order, I think essentially they're a permanent fixture of it now. But again, the founding era would have said they ought not be a permanent part of the order. And well into the 1830s, you find presidents of the United States saying we really don't need parties. At this point, they're somewhat disingenuous about it. But so I really am. I'm a historian, and I'm going to stop there as to whether they're essential in the 21st century. But I do think that it seems clear to me that the Tocquevillian explanation of the value of them, of otherwise powerless, maybe too strong a word, but otherwise weak individuals finding ways to join together to do something and make something happen, that seems really valuable in a democracy, and it creates for Tocqueville a substitute for relying on the hand of the state to solve all problems, right? And that's why Tocqueville is just as appealing to both the left and the right in the 21st century in different ways. And that's, I'll stop there. It's interesting, and it's a great question. Putnam is putting his finger on a problem, just like I think some of the people I was talking about tonight were, but I don't know what the answer is exactly to it. See, 3 or 4, and you want me to stop by 7:30, right? Okay.
Thank you. This has been fantastic, and congratulations on the book. I'm intrigued by your claim that technology, how technology factored into the age of Tocqueville and the explosion of sort of associations in the early middle part of the 19th century. You show that technology, with the expansion of the printing press and even the idea of written constitutions, helped develop this idea of associational life. Can technology also, in your judgment, this is maybe putting on just another cap, but can technology also sort of undermine associational life? I think people have written recently, again, worrying about the Robert Putnam effect, that modern 21st century technology has a way of maybe undermining associations with smartphones and apps and things like that. Do you have any thoughts on how technology can kind of perhaps undermine associational life?
I will say one of the things that stands out to me about the value of early U.S. associationalism is the practice of it. That it's not simply pooling of resources to do something, kind of crowdfunding, the kinds of things the technology can allow for collective action to do things very quickly and very effectively. But just the actual practice of it, it seems to be a part, it helps to build that social trust. Again, the ladies of Norwich, Connecticut are not the perfect example because they all knew one another anyway, but imagine a more expansive organization. It helps to build trust, it helps to accomplish things. And technologically enabled cooperation doesn't seem to do those same things. Here I'd be building on, or just referring to other people's work, thinking about the ways that there's more siloization and being connected with people who think exactly like you do, that's enabled by modern technology that wasn't fully the case in the earlier generations of associations. I'm too much of a historian to have much sense of the 21st century possibilities and dangers of technologically enabled association formation. But I will say that I've seen some descriptions recently that point out ways in which, and crowdfunding actually is a part of this, ways in which it is creating new approaches to solving really classic problems, like being able to pool resources quickly and effectively without intermediaries and without having to go to the state or some rich or powerful person. And that part I see as kind of having a similar impulse to that Tocquevillian one. But no real thoughts on whether technology is going to destroy us or make things better. I'll puzzle over this, as we've said. Aslan, do you want to pick two more, and we'll? Yes. Okay.
I was struck by Washington's skepticism, which got me thinking about how, in his career right then, he was sort of in trouble with the Society of Cincinnati that people mistrusted because they thought it was elites going to oppress them. And then, of course, the Sons of Liberty were a voluntary association before then, which were disruptive. And go down to today, you know, we've got Oath Keepers, we've got lots of voluntary associations that are not necessarily benign.
Yeah.
So how do we, did Tocqueville think about this? How do we cope with this?
Tocqueville didn't think about it as much as others did. You're exactly right. When Washington saw private associations, he had in his mind potentially dangerous ones, but also I think he had in mind ones that were very much a part of his world. That is the revolutionary mobilization, and actually the associations, the capital A associations of the 1760s and the 1770s, ways that people effectively undermine an empire just by joining together. And Washington saw the power of that potential association, or of that potential collective action, and that was real to him. And very recently, obviously post-January 6th, I think was an impulse for it. There was a really good gathering of scholarship on your point about what the collection was called Uncivil Civil Society. What are the ways in which some organizations, Oath Keepers, were I think described explicitly, but also the rise of Nazism, right, and in Weimar Germany. What are the ways that certain kinds of associations that have all the earmarks of everything that we've just talked about in the more laudatory kind of tones, but are doing something truly and dangerously subversive? Those things exist side by side with one another. And so I think the anxiety of the founding era that Washington nicely described in those letters to his nephew is one we should still take seriously. There is a potential danger to associations. And I think that the fact that they have effectively, in Washington's lifetime, that they had effectively toppled and transformed the political world he lived in is something he would never forget. The Society of Cincinnati, very quickly, yes, that is a big part of Washington's sense of these things, but it's also something he joined. He didn't hesitate to join. Once asked, he joined, and he was their president, obviously, because he was president of everything that he joined. But that is another great example of an organization that, by the way, still exists, and I find to be really fairly harmless in the 21st century, but in the 18th century was seen as deeply dangerous. Okay.
Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering, in the course of your research, if you ever came across associations being interested in the right to petition. The reason I ask this is that the House has had a functional right to petition, a public docket, until the 40s, when it sort of gave it all away to the executive branch in the form of agencies. So this public grievance process existed as a side door into the lawmaking influence if you couldn't vote, which was most people. And that it seems to me like reimagining the right to petition in the modern world is really key to figuring out how public serving institutions take that power back in the face of, now ChatGPT or, the really advertising platforms that are pretending to be public squares.
Well,
social media.
I spent this entire conversation not mentioning the First Amendment, which I could have, because that right to assemble and petition are right next to each other. And the right of association, which the Supreme Court described most fully in 1958 with an NAACP case, is something that it comes out of that sort of broad reading of the First Amendment. And if you go back a generation, in the generations that I'm describing, so essentially from the 1780s into the 1830s, many of the organizations that I'm describing regarding the issue of slavery and temperance, that was an active part of what they did, right? They drew up petitions and they found ways to submit them. Particularly, the African American organizations would join together and work to create these petitions that would then be submitted. There is a point at which most organizations of those sorts decide to act more directly to try to accomplish things rather than, kind of to Tocqueville's point, that associations were there to do, not to get the government to do. But it really was a key part of their work. And I imagine now if we walked around the outside of the Join In exhibit, the outer walls, we would see a lot of examples of 19th and 20th century organizations that found ways to mobilize petition efforts and mobilize political efforts in exactly the vein that you're describing. So I can just say historically that certainly in the 19th century it was an important way in which many of these associations found or made their impact. And I think you're exactly right that it's obviously a much different landscape in the 20th and into the 21st. Thank you, Aslan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butterfield, for that engaging and clearly thought-provoking discussion. We do hope you will have an opportunity to actually visit the exhibit, which is right past the South Gallery there and behind the Not an Ostrich exhibition. And we also hope that you'll visit the Law Library's Legal Research Institute online, where we post our other events and webinars. It's law.gov, very easy to remember. And also please visit John W. Kluge Center's website as well at loc.gov, and they obviously have many upcoming events. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening.